Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back to our second week of our series, Embodied. We are looking at God's design for human bodies, including all kinds of contentiously debated issues in our society. But before we get into all of that a little bit later in our series, our goal is to build a thorough and a thoughtful unpacking of God's design to begin with. So last week we started here with God's design for the human bodies, and here was our simple definition. We are psychosomatic unions made to image God, to be filled with his spirit, and to cultivate the earth with God. Now, I don't have time this morning to unpack all of that. I would really encourage you to go back and listen to last week's sermon if you weren't here with us. But just to summarize, God made us as embodied souls. We are not bodies with souls. We are not souls with bodies. They are interwoven. We are fused. We are dust and divinity. That's the language of Genesis 2, the picture of God forming man out of the dust and then breathing his divine life into him. That's the picture. Today, we're going to pick back up where we started in Genesis 1, 26 through 28. We're going to continue to build and get a little more specific. So starting back in Genesis 1, verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So where the Radiohead song came from. Okay, so we covered this last week. We are made in the image of God to reflect his splendor, his beauty, his wisdom, wherever we go in the world. We are imaging him where that was the intended design. We are invited to cultivate the earth, to bring order to chaos. I want to focus specifically today on a connection in verse 26 and 27 where things will really take off for what we're talking about this morning. So in the beginning of verse 26, then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." So in the Hebrew, linguistically, this is rich. It's interesting. 26 starts with God, one God who says, "Let us." For most Christian theologians, this is one of the first indications of the Trinity in the scriptures. God calls himself an us. This is especially interesting in the Hebrew because the let us is plural, but the next word make is singular. It would be like if you looked at your friend right now and said, "Hey, after church this morning, we am going to brunch." It's like intentionally grammatically correct to draw our attention to something. Like God's trying to tell us something about himself, that he is both plural and singular at the same time. And I want you to connect this rich language, "let us make man in our image," go straight to verse 27 now. So God created man in his own image. So that's simple enough. One God, one man made in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Worked well enough the first time, just run it back. One God, one man made in his image. I'm tracking. Male and female, he created them. Well, that's new. And it's intentional. And it's beautiful. And its importance can't be overstated. Male and female, both created in God's image and likeness. Almost as if God is trying to tell us that it takes more than a singular human to reflect his image because he is a communal being, eternally existing in community with himself. We get confirmation of this, that we'll get to this later in Genesis 2, verse 18, when God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone." It's the first time in the Bible that God says anything is not good, and it comes before the fall, before the curse of sin. God says it's not good for the man to be alone. Okay, so this statement in verse 27, that male and female are both created in God's image, it's massively important to us on two levels. And this is what we're really going to unpack this morning. Here are the two levels. First, it emphasizes the equality of male and female. It emphasizes the equality. And secondly, simultaneously, it acknowledges the difference between male and female. It does both at the same time. First, it emphasizes the equality. Second, it acknowledges the difference. And we're going to spend this whole morning really unpacking those two. Let's start with the first one, the emphasis on equality. So you may know this, you may not know this. It may surprise you to know that Genesis stands out when it's compared to other creation stories or explanations for how we got here and where we come from. While other creation stories sometimes include female deities or demigods in the process, almost none ever even mention women being created. It's like they're an afterthought. Genesis stands out. It's not the case. They're not an afterthought in Genesis. They're right there, male and female, both made in God's image. God says men and women, male and female, are both created in his image, both created in his likeness, equal in dignity, worth, and value, equal in image reflecting the likeness of God. So I'll say it this way. We are more the same than we are different. Males and females, men and women in the room. We are more the same than far more the same than we are different. Whatever differences exist are much smaller compared to the sameness, the equality between us. I'll say it this way. Men are not from Mars and women are not from Venus. Men are from God and women are from God. And that's beautiful. Keep going in verse 28 of chapter 1. And God blessed them. Who? Them, male and female. He blesses both of them equally. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So this is a repetition of the mandate in verse 26, but why repeat it? Well, because now it's being repeated to both male and female. They are equally both getting the call and the command to subdue the earth, to have dominion over the earth. There's an equality in design, there's an equality in image-bearing capability, and there's an equality in the calling to join God in cultivating the earth and bringing order to chaos. Okay, so go back to the definition that we started with last week. We are psychosomatic unions made in God's image to be filled with God's spirit and to cultivate the earth with God. Okay, here's my question. Which ones of us, males or females? Yes, both. Made in God's image? Yes, both. Able to be filled with God's spirit? Yes, both. Called to cultivate the earth with God? Yes, both. Yeah, totally. But which one's better, right? I mean, biblically speaking, in light of Genesis, that's nonsense. It's the equivalent of asking, why is Taylor Swift such a financial failure? No, I don't think you know what those words mean. That's not how that works. Or Travis Kelce is bad at publicity and marketing. No, he's not. He's very good at it. What? Now, the beauty of Genesis' emphasis on equality, it likely doesn't stand out that much to us. It likely doesn't surprise us very much because we tend to assume this in our cultural sensibilities, which I don't have time to unpack this, but those are largely formed by Genesis. It's not important. Keep going. By contrast, if you lived in Mesopotamia when Genesis was written, you'd have found the equality of Genesis shocking. You'd have found it shocking. Here's what I mean. Surrounding God's people, there were multiple cultures with varying creation myths that explained where we come from and why the world is the way it is. The most popular, influential one was the Babylonian Enuma Elish. In the Enuma Elish, the gods came from the waters. Two different types of waters. There was the freshwater, peaceful, masculine river that collided with the more tumultuous saltwater sea, the feminine sea. And where those two hit, that brackish water was a pool of teeming currents from which the gods sprung forth. And they made more gods, and they wrestled with each other, and they warred, and they raged until one god, Marduk, arose as the most powerful. But along with being the most powerful, he was very arrogant. He despised his watery home, so he led a revolt. He gathered an army of monsters. He went to war with his mother, the sea. Long story short, he brutally murders her. He cuts her in half and forms the heavens and the earth from the two bloody halves of her murdered body. He then kills her gentleman lover and makes a multitude of tiny slaves from his blood, whose sole purpose is to serve him and the other gods. I have great news for you. According to the Enuma Elish, that's you. You are a little lemming, blood-formed slave who exists to serve insane narcissist demigods. That's where people come from. That's where male and female come from. So I would argue that compared to the Enuma Elish, the Genesis account is a breath of fresh air. Like, we inhabit a divinely ordered, harmonious, created cosmos. Humans aren't created from chaotic, warring demigods as mindless slaves for insane narcissists. Male and female, we are made in God's image, endowed with unique dignity, purpose, and work. We are mindful, not mindless. Women are essential to creation. Men are essential to creation. And so if I was a betting man, I'm betting the mortgage that 100% of us in the room, if you only had the two options, you're picking Genesis over the Enuma Elish, right? The equality, you can have the equality of Genesis for men and women, or you can have the insanity of the Enuma Elish. Your choice. I'm betting the mortgage. My wife wouldn't like that, but the Genesis account doesn't just stop with the emphasis on equality. It also acknowledges differentiation. Male and female, he created them. We get even more clarity on this in Genesis 2, okay? So it's not a chronological continuation. What Genesis 2 does is it's like it zooms in the camera lens and expounds on the creation of humanity. We'll pick it up in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." So we mentioned this earlier in God's call for humanity to image and cultivate the earth with him. A lone man is insufficient for the task, but God has a plan to fix this situation. He will make a helper fit for him. In the Hebrew, a helper fit for him is an ezer neged. Other times we've covered this, we've mentioned that to consider the word helper, which gets connected to the formation of the first woman here, to consider that a demeaning term is an error. It's a very bad reading of the scriptures. Here's a couple reasons why. For one, in other places, God calls himself an ezer. He does, in no way does he consider this term demeaning. He calls himself that. For two, the word literally means a life-giving aid and help. So the picture I always have of this is, imagine if you were in a war-torn nation and the Peace Corps arrived with aid for you, and your house was just blown up and family members have died, and the Peace Corps arrives with life-giving aid, and you would not look at them and say, "Those lowly losers helping all these people and giving them life and stuff. How dare you?" It's not a demeaning term. It's a beautiful term. Is there. Secondly, the second part, neged, means suitable, fit for, a match. It echoes the equality that we have already seen. Keep going, verse 19. Now out of the ground, the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all livestock and to the birds of the heavens and to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. That's the same phrase, an ezer neged. Interesting to me that before providing Adam with the solution that God already knows he's going to provide for Adam, first, God puts the man to work. Two notes here about the task that God gives to Adam. First, both Genesis 1 and 2 depict a particular relationship between language and reality. So in chapter 1, God speaks creation into existence ex nihilo. That means out of nothing. So God's words have the power to create reality. In Genesis 2, God gives man the task of naming reality. In other words, man's words have the power to identify reality as God has made it. There's a relationship here. We don't have time to unpack that right now. It's an interesting note. Could come up later in the series. Number 2. In the task God gives Adam to name all of the animals, there's a certain baked in frustration. Here's what I mean. This is a little bit speculative, but I'd bet if you were Adam that naming the animals was great at first. Like, here's what I mean. Like, imagine remember the first time you ever went to the zoo? What if you got to name every one of those things you saw? And you came up with lion, giraffe, aardvark. I mean, like, how fun would that be? I bet Adam giggled for a minute when he came up with aardvark. I mean, but I wonder if after a while, this gnawing sense started to grow that none of these animals, wonderful and majestic as they were, none of them were a suitable match. None of them were an Ezer Neged for Adam. That's what verse 20 says. Keep reading verse 21. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. So there's some subtle but significant difference here in the way that Adam and Eve are created, right? Adam is formed from the dust and God breathes life into him. Eve is taken from one of Adam's ribs and God forms her into a whole human woman from the rib. Factually, those are different. They are different processes. And there is no reason to assume that one is superior to the other. They can be equal and different. No reason to act like they're identical. They can be equal and different. We continue to see this equality and this difference in Adam's response as God essentially walks Eve down the aisle to him for the first marriage ceremony ever in verse 23. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." Adam, upon seeing the first woman, breaks out into poetry. Can you hear the delight and relief? This at last. He's singing Etta James right off the bat. At last, one like me, suitable for me, bone of my bones, our skeletal structures match. Flesh of my flesh, our bodies match. You don't have spots or tusks or a 12-foot long neck. And immediately in his words, there's a declaration of the equality theme we've been seeing over and over. Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. We're the same. We match. We were made for each other. And in the same breath, there's an acknowledgement of her difference to him. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. The Hebrew words here are even more fascinating. The Hebrew words are Ish and Ishah. She shall be called Ishah, for she was taken out of Ish. You see what he's saying? Me, Ish. Her, Ishah. She's so much like me, but a little different. Ish and Ishah, we go together for sure. I'm carving that in a tree right away. Ish and Ishah, forever. We're so similar, but she's got a little extra extra je ne sais quoi. Dr. Abigail Favali, a PhD theologian, writer, and professor at Notre Dame, she makes two fascinating points here in her book called The Genesis of Gender that I highly recommend if you want to dig deeper on all of this stuff. Here's the first point she makes. Genesis affirms a balance of sameness and difference between the sexes. This is a delicate balance that is difficult but necessary to maintain. Most theories of gender lose this balance, veering into extremes of uniformity or polarity. Both extremes lose the fruitful tension expressed here. Sexual differentiation is not a mishap, but cause for celebration and wonder. This difference is good. Our bodies are good, and both of these are an integral part of the created order, which is good. Do you hear what she's saying? She's saying there's an equality and a differentiation that you can't get away from, but you don't need to. And you don't need to want to. It's good. It's beautiful. It's intentional. It's not an accident. God knew what he was doing. He did a good job. Here's her second insight. Genesis 2 emphasizes another vital principle. The body reveals the person. Each person's unique personhood can only be made known to others through the frame of our embodiment. This sacramentality is displayed in the man's immediate recognition of the woman. They have not yet spoken. She has not verbally introduced herself. Her body speaks the truth of her identity, and this truth is immediately recognized by the man, who is struck with joy and wonder at the revelation of a person with whom he can, at last, have true communion. He immediately recognizes in the silent declaration of her body that she is both like him, more like him than any other earthly creature, and also not like him. It's beautiful. We are far more the same than we are different. And you are welcome to text in any questions you'd like about that second quote, but that's profound. It's profound in light of what we talked about last week. Since we are not souls stuck inside of cage-like bodies, but rather psychosomatic unions made in God's image, our bodies reveal fundamental reality about us and God's created order. She calls it sacramentality. We talked about this a few weeks ago in People of the Pages, that both hospitality and brotherly love they can be made sacred. They're normal things of earth that God can infuse with sacred power. Our bodies are the same. We are equally made in God's image. We are uniquely different at the same time. And there are object lessons about God's nature and design hardwired into our equality and our differences. Okay, so I'm taking my time here. You've probably noticed that. I'm not going quickly because the 2 points are massively important. Don't breeze by this, okay? I mean, when you think about the first things in Genesis that we learn about the world and human beings, the first things we learn, number one, God created them. He made them in his image, which we discussed last week. Number two, the very next thing we learn about human beings, before we learn anything else, before we learn what they want, how they behave, what they're like, if they're good or bad, we learn that God created them, chapter 1, male and female, chapter 2, man and woman, Ish and Ishah. Among God's human creation, of which there is lots of different meaningful differentiation, the first differentiation we are given is that human beings will come in 2 categories, male and female. This will be one of the most meaningful ways that you can form human persons into groups. Same species, 2 groups amongst that species that will result in differentiation. Now we've got time in this series to unpack some ways that our culture may or may not love those ideas. But here's where I want to start today. If the Bible is right, if all of that is true, then we would expect to see observable differentiation between male and female, would we not? If the Bible's right, we'd expect to see observable differentiation between men and women. And as it just so happens, we do. We find meaningful, observable differentiation at multiple levels. The simplest level to find differentiation occurs anatomically speaking. Okay? So in fact, according to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, if you die and you are buried, and in 100 years someone finds your skeleton, one of the only primary things they will be able to tell about you is your gender. They will not be able to tell about your wealth or your occupation, what kind of family you grew up in. They'll be able to guess at your race. They'll guess at your age. They might be able to tell what killed you or if you had any significant bone breaks, but they'll definitely be able to tell what your gender was. In fact, you can often determine gender if all you have is the skull or even just the teeth. I find that fascinating. National Center for Biotechnology Information. You can come ask me, you can email me, I'll give you every bit of research. Much of the anatomical differences we find in men and women relates to God's call in Genesis 1:28 to be fruitful and multiply. All right, so think about it this way. A man's body doesn't make sense by itself. nor does a woman's body. But seen in light of each other, they point to each other as a set. In other words, a man's body is complete in all of its systems but one. A woman's body is complete in all of its majestic systems but one, and those respective reproductive systems only function in union with each other. Here's a different way to think about it. If an alien race came to Earth, we would assume they are good at science. They have made it here. What would their research conclude? Would it not conclude that regardless of any other similarities and differences in clothing, in hairstyle, in behavior, in temperament, that one kind of human has that part, and one kind of human has that part, and the way they reproduce is by putting that part in that part? This alien researcher would report back to his commanding officer, likely a high-capacity female alien, and she would reward her male subordinate with an A+ for his accurate and outstanding work. Now, you will notice here, the Bible and the way God frames it is that a person's reproductive potentiality is what determines their gender. I don't have time this morning to present the argument for that, but if that's of interest for you, that's part of why we are giving you the opportunity to send in questions and to help dictate what the final sermon of this series will be. Ask whatever questions you've got. We'll have the conversation. I mean it. But the differences are not just anatomical structure. You also find them in temperament. For instance, there was a study done by the UK's Channel 4 that I find to be both humorous and deeply disturbing. The study was called Boys Alone and Girls Alone. You can find lots of information on it in the internet, tons of videos on YouTube. They put 10 boys and 10 girls aged 8 through 11 in 2 different houses with no adult supervision at all for a week. I will say it goes pretty well for one of the houses. Meanwhile, the boys literally formed gangs. I don't know why the UK is killing it on this, but there's a fascinating BBC article called "Do Men and Women Really Have Different Personalities?" And it's a very fair, even-handed article that goes through tons of research, study after study, that found no matter what factors you control for, age, culture, whether you're rating yourself, whether you're rating your friends and other people, over and over, very similar differences in temperament showed up, especially when it came to the categories of agreeableness, neuroticism, and openness to new experiences. There's also differentiation in terms of physical capabilities. So this relates back to the anatomical structure. Female hips are structured differently than male hips. This is so that females are capable of not just carrying offspring, but also delivering offspring. So due to the structure of male hips, even if a male could carry offspring, he could not deliver it. One result is that on average, at every single age, men are faster than women. Similarly, according to the National Library of Medicine, an average woman has 52% of the upper body strength and 66% of the lower body strength of the average man. Overall, the average woman is stronger than 2.5% of men, and the average man is stronger than 97.5% of women. You will note, I did not just say there aren't women in this world who are stronger than me, because there absolutely are. And yet, if you take at all a serious statistical scientific approach to it, there is an observable difference. All of this is why we have men's and women's divisions in most sports. If we just had one division and we said, let's just have all of the best people, male or female, play together, then no females would have the opportunity to compete in sports that accentuate explosiveness. And no males would be able to compete in things like balance beam. Because again, because of different hip structures, females have a lower center of gravity than males. allowing them to have far superior balance on average. Males and females have observable difference in the makeup of our brains as well. There's a part of your brain called the corpus callosum that connects the two bilateral halves of your brain together. Females on average have a much more developed corpus callosum compared to the overall size of their brain. One fascinating study that showed a surprising result of this, okay? I was in college, it was very late at night, I was watching the Discovery Channel. They were doing a show about boys and girls and the differences therein, and they talked about this study in which scientists, what they did is they took boys and girls, same age, same backgrounds, controlled all the factors, put them in a small area, and they dropped dollar bills from the ceiling. And the task was catch as many dollar bills as you can before they hit the ground. On average, the boys caught $12 bills as they were falling down. On average, the girls caught so few that the average rounds down to 0. The scientists were stumped. They said, what could possibly explain this? And as they studied, they found that the difference in the corpus callosum explained it. So because the girls' corpus callosum was larger and more developed, when they look up and see the dollar bills falling, they see the whole picture more quickly, and it is harder to focus on one and catch one at a time. Meanwhile, the boys' simpler, less developed brain looked up and saw $1. And you make whatever you want of that study. I really do. I know I said that one kind of funny, but listen, I hope you're hearing me right. None of this is about are men or women better than each other. All of this can be considered thoughtfully in terms of causation and implications, but the conclusion of a multitude of cross-disciplinary, cross-cultural studies is simply that Genesis is correct. Observable differentiation between males and females exists. Observable differentiation between male and female exists. The Bible's right. Genesis is right. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, but why? Why does that even matter? And to me, this is actually where things get excessively majestic. This is where they get the most beautiful, because the answer to that question is because we need each other. That's why it matters, because we need each other. I'll show you from the text, and then we'll just talk about it for a minute. Back in Genesis 1:28, we saw the call given to both male and female, and part of it was subdue it and have dominion. Who was that call given to? Male and female, which means it's not a call that can be accomplished without each other. You don't give the same command to both together unless you intend them to do it together, because we need each other. It gets more clear, the command right above that. Be fruitful and multiply. We cannot do that alone. We need each other to obey and accomplish God's vision and goal. 1 Corinthians 11 through 12 says that this physical reliance on each other actually has a deeper reality. I love this verse. Nevertheless, in the Lord, if you're following Jesus, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. This verse says that there's a physical dependence on each other that points at a deeper, we are not independent of each other. We're interdependent. We need each other. One of the societal ways that you can point to this in a really drastic and painful way is just to look at the effect of families when one parent is missing. So 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes, which is 5 times the national average. 90%, 9 out of 10 of all homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. That's 32 times the average. 85% of all children who show behavior disorders come from fatherless homes. 71% of all high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. It's interesting that significantly less research has been done on motherless homes, in part because you find significantly fewer of them, about 80% less. But the research that has been done shows that a motherless home, the effects on the children without mothers almost always involve their mental health. higher anxiety, higher depression, lower chance of forming healthy relationships with any adults other than their dad that they grew up with, higher chance of ending up in abusive relationships. What's the point? Every study ever done shows that for children to thrive most, they thrive most when they receive contribution from both men and women. In other words, we need each other. In other words, we need each other. The best marriages are marked by men and women who walk in a mutual respect and awareness of their need for each other, emphasizing equality while acknowledging difference. The best governments are marked by men and women who walk in a mutual respect and awareness of their need for each other, emphasizing equality while acknowledging difference. The best neighborhoods, the best teams, the best churches are marked by men and women who see each other in both equality and difference with honor and love. Now, I know that the Genesis narrative does not end in chapter 2. And I know all of the pain and damage that is coming in chapter 3. I know that in one small page, we will go from the very good of Genesis 1:31, when God looked at all of creation and he said it's very good. In one page, we'll go from the naked and unashamed of Genesis 2:25, and it will be replaced with two sinful, shame-filled people hiding from God and each other behind bushes that he made. I know that in the curse of sin, the power dynamics between men and women will be turned upside down, and the beautiful, harmonious, interdependent relationship that God designed for men and women to walk in together will be crushed. I know much of the history of sinful destruction that men and women have caused each other: domestic violence, sexual sin, family destruction. I know that you in this room have experienced much of that. And I hate it. I hate all of that. And I know the society that we live in. And I'll be really honest with you this morning. I hate every aspect of our society where I see men and women pitting themselves against each other, trying to dominate or undermine each other. Every nonsense, stereotyped, demeaning comment from men about women being overly emotional and incapable of high-level thought. I hate it. Every moronic depiction of men and fathers as either idiots or evil or some combination of both. I hate it. I hate it all. I know where it comes from. I know the reality of the brokenness of the world we live in. We will talk about more of all of it throughout the series, but maybe just for a moment today, could we just mourn it? Maybe today, instead of responding to that brokenness with the temptation to say, well, there are no differences at all, or it's just equality and there's no differences at all. Maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe we could just lament and mourn the brokenness. Or maybe you're not. Maybe you're tempted to pit them against each other. Men, good. Women, got hurt by a woman. Well, maybe that's not the right move. Maybe that doesn't actually bring healing. Maybe we just mourn it. Maybe we lament the brokenness. So here's our conclusion for today. Here's our takeaway. Part of being a Christian, part of being a Christ follower means affirming and honoring the gender you are not. Say that again. As Christians, part of being a Christ follower means affirming and honoring the gender you are not. As men, we honor women. As women, we honor men. So if someone is saying something demeaning about women, I encourage you, men, that your response might be, hey, I don't love that. Women are awesome. God made them in his image. We need them. And if someone is saying something demeaning about men, maybe women, you pipe up and you go, hey, I don't love that. Men are awesome. We're made in God's image and we need them. My life is incalculably better because of the presence of strong, passionate, smart, God's image-bearing women in my life. My mom, my wife, my sisters, my grandmothers, my daughters, close female friends throughout my life. They are grace gifts to me, made in God's image, equal in value, dignity, and worth, with observable differences. They are thankful for those differences from me. And I am so thankful for their presence in my life and how God has used them to shape me. And my life is incalculably better because of the presence of gracious, strong men in my life. Friends and mentors, my sons, they are incredible grace gifts. I'm not anything of who God has shaped me to be without their presence as well. And so whatever experiences, good or terrible, you have had with the opposite gender in your life, likely a good mixture of both, my prayer for us this morning and for all the years to come is that in this church family, you would find hope and healing and a beautiful lived out picture of the reality that we need each other and we honor each other in both our equality and in our differentiation. Let's pray.